not limited to business ethics, and also promote socially responsible behavior by businesses and people that lead them. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd like to ask Father Kevin to come up and say a prayer of remembrance. Father?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to see so many of us gathered here in the Siena community and to be able to both welcome back one of our alums, but also to have the opportunity to hear and to share some reflections on a very significant topic. You know, there are many quips who will say that to talk about ethics and business is an oxymoron. And yet, I would like to remind everyone in the Siena community that one of the powers of the early Franciscan movement was that the friars left the churches and went into the marketplaces and began to preach to folks who were doing commerce. And part of the reflections that they would share with people were very basic, very fundamental. Things we know since we're children, the things that we have difficulty at times as adults actualizing in our life. So those early friars would talk to people about being honest, telling the truth, being fair and just, and never exploiting individuals. That preaching caught on in the 13th century. For a short period of time, it helped to revolutionize the city of Florence. Our very patron, Bernardine of Siena, stood in the piazza of the city of Siena and had many such reflections challenging the business community. So I'd like to see ourselves here as a Franciscan community connected to that initial experience, and that we have the great privilege of passing that on. And as you come together this night, we remember in this lecture Louis Golub, who was a gentleman who served the wider capital region in business and commerce. He was dedicated to his family, to the people that he touched. He was dedicated to Siena College and served on its board. And I had the privilege for a very short time when I first joined the board of serving with him. He was a voice and call for the types of behavior that those early friars did. And not only call for it, he lived it. So this night, as we gather and as we welcome and look back and join in this reflection, let us begin in prayer. Loving God, we give you thanks this night for bringing us together. We thank you for the gift of Louis Golub, to his family, to this community, and to Siena College. We give thanks, too, that we gathered here and that we're able to reflect upon the important values that have driven and continue to challenge this college. May we always be mindful and respectful of one another. May we be mindful of the dignity of each person. And may we live in a community that fosters justice and peace and has that special concern for sisters and brothers who are in need. Watch over us this night and bless us in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you, Father. Often when I think of business ethics, a simple story comes to my mind. One of where a woman walks into a butcher shop after a long day when the butcher's had a pretty successful day and asks for a whole chicken that's on sale. The butcher goes to the cooler and realizes that that's his last chicken. And as he puts it on the scale, he tells her, that will be $12. And she says, you know what? I think I would like a bigger one. And so the butcher goes back to the cooler, opens in, stares into the cooler blankly for a few seconds, grabs the same chicken, comes back, throws it on the scale, and says, that will be $13. She says, you know what? I'll take both of them, please. And certainly that's the ending of this story, and I can imagine if you were to add a different ending to this story, someone's got to explain themselves, right, of how they misled a customer. And that butcher could have been the owner of this business, or he certainly is definitely a prominent employee that faces customers throughout the day. And you think of other businesses, whether you're a business of 10 people or 100 people or thousands or 10,000s, and how many of those people on a daily basis are having conversations with your customers? And how are they representing your business? And how are they behaving ethically or not ethically? I think for the most part, people are good and do behave ethically, but there is always a few that don't. So how do organizations focus to make sure that the right behaviors are happening and that the right promises and the right conversations are happening with their customers? Certainly one way to do that is with policies and rules. Certainly a better way to do that is establish a culture where ethics is strong. And what a better way to establish a culture than actually to establish and rule it through core values. And that's the topic of the conversation that our speaker is going to share with us tonight, is ethics as a core value of the business. So Mr. Steverson joined Corning Incorporated as a Senior Vice President and General Counsel in June of this past year. And prior to joining Corning, he served as Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of Motorola Solutions, Inc. And previously, he was Senior Vice President of Law for Motorola's Enterprise Mobility Solutions business. During his 18 years with Motorola, he held a variety of leadership roles across the company's numerous business units. And prior to Motorola, he was in private practice as the law firm of Arnold and Porter. Mr. Steverson is a member of the Illinois State Bar, the Colorado State Bar, the American Society of Corporate Secretaries, the Economic Club of Chicago, the Executive Club of Chicago, and the North Shore General Counsels Association. He also serves on boards for the Big Shoulders Fund and the Northwestern Lake Forest Hospital. Proudly, he earned a degree from Siena College as an English major in 1987 and then went on to Harvard Law School. Please join me in welcoming Louis Steverson back to Siena College.
Let's try again. Maybe I'll just, should I take this one off and use this one? What do you think? We good? All right. Okay. So first of all, it is weird to be back here. I have literally not set foot on campus since 1988. I've been past it, but I haven't set foot on campus. We took a tour. We went around in Father's golf cart, which is cool. We drove around. There's things I recognized, there's things I didn't recognize, so it felt really, really weird. But I'm thrilled to be back. Brad asked me to talk about a few things. He asked me to talk. He wanted me to give you a little bit of sort of how I got from here in '87 to where I am now. So I'll spend some time talking about that. And then we'll talk about the evolution of ethics generally. And then we'll talk about ethics in business and why it's so critically important within business. You may notice I feel a little constrained up here. I was a litigator, and I'm used to walking in the courtroom. And then when I make presentations at work, I walk around a lot. So I'm a little constrained, but I'm gonna make do. So, like I said, Brad came to see me. He came to see me when I was still at Motorola. I was in Chicago. And he came to see me earlier this year, and he said, hey, we'd really like you to come and reconnect with the Siena community. You've been gone a long time, we'd like you to reconnect. And I said, that's great. What do you have in mind? And he had a few things in mind, and we did a few of those things. They said, I'd like you to come back and talk. I'd like you to come and make a speech. And this was probably 9 months ago. And 9 months ago, I was like, well, that's great, because you got a lot of time between then and 9 months to prepare. Well, then I took a new job. I went from Motorola to Corning. I moved from Chicago to New York. I worked on a massive transaction for Corning. As soon as I got there, they took me to Korea for weeks, San Francisco. So let's just say the time kind of evaporated. But once I got into it and started digging in and getting ready, I really enjoyed sort of the preparation. I hadn't done anything like this in quite a while. The kind of things that I typically present on, it's kind of a given, right? When you talk about ethics within the business setting, it's kind of a given, right? What I'm doing there is just training. But here, I wanted to talk about sort of the evolution of it, how did it come about, how did it get into business, etc. And so I really dug into it, and I really enjoyed the preparation. And I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled to be here. So, as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about my journey from Seattle to Golub. We're going to talk about the evolution of ethics. I'm going to call on some of you using the Socratic method. I hope you're ready for that. And then we're going to talk about the criticality of ethics in the business environment. So first, hopefully this is going to work. How did I get from Seattle to Golub? Well, it's not that far, 200 miles, right? So you think, pretty direct route, get an 88, southeast, boom, you run right into it. Well, I took a little bit more circuitous route. Graduated here in 87. My dad was a New York State Trooper. In fact, my dad was the first black New York State Trooper, which some of mine always thought was pretty cool. I was pretty proud of Dad about that. So I always had kind of a law-related bent to me, right? My sister went to law school as well. She's a law professor, horrible lawyer, great professor. Don't tell her I said that. She'll probably see it on YouTube, and I'll get some grief for that. But I thought when I graduated here that I probably wanted to go to law school, but I wasn't quite sure. So I took a job as a paralegal down in Washington, D.C., working for a law firm called Golub. Almost persuaded me not to go to law school. Working on a huge antitrust case, horrifying. Anyway, took the LCT, did okay in that. Applied to 8 schools. Fortunately, I did well enough on the LCT, got into all 8 schools, came down to Harvard and Stanford. I spent about 5 minutes at Harvard. The weather wasn't all that great. I went over to Stanford. I spent 2 weeks in Stanford in the sun and fun. I came back, I talked to my family. I said, hey, maybe I might want to go to Stanford. Everybody listened to me. My mom sat me down and she said, yeah, I'm sure Stanford's a wonderful place. You don't go to Harvard, I disown you. I went to Harvard. You know, so I was at Harvard, and honestly, to be perfectly honest, I didn't really like law school all that much. A couple of reasons. First, it's law school. You think in law school, they will teach you to be a lawyer. They don't teach you to be a lawyer, they teach you to think like a lawyer. You know, you go to business school, they teach you how to go into business. You go to medical school, they teach you how to be a doctor. They don't teach you that in law school. That comes much later. So that kind of annoyed me a bit. Then there's the humbling factor of Harvard, right? I was at Siena College, and I felt pretty good about myself, right? I graduated top of my class, 99 percentile in the LCT, All-American athlete, people liked me, it was great. I figured, how hard could this Harvard thing be, right? Well, I get to Harvard, everybody's resume looks exactly like mine, or better, and then there were the freaks. There were the people who were intellectual giants. I went to school with Judge Posner's son. I went to school with Andy Schlafly. I went to school with Laura Hamlin, Ken Mack. And then, the coup de grace, I got to go to school with Barack Obama. So I get to, and I will tell you, Barack is a wonderful guy. He's a super smart guy. There's us. That's the Black Law Students Association. That's me down there. Don't say anything about that Bill Cosby sweater. Hey, don't hate the player. I'm telling you, we thought we looked good back then. There's the president up there. You might notice this guy here. That is, his name at the time was Frank Harper. It's now Hill Harper. You may have seen him on CSI New York. He went a completely different route than we went. This guy over here, I'm just noticing as I pulled this picture up. And the reason I had this picture is because I got in an argument with Ron Emanuel. You know Ron Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago? I met him a little while ago, and my boss at the time happened to mention that I went to Harvard. He goes, hey, no, everybody's saying I went to Harvard with Obama. I'm like, I did. I can prove it. So I pulled up this picture. Anyway, this guy over in the corner, I don't know what he's doing. He kind of freaked me out when I pulled this picture up. I don't know what he's thinking about. So anyway, so you're probably thinking, well, that's kind of cool, right? You got to go to school with the president. All 3 years. I don't know him super well, but I know him, right? It has its pluses, and it has its minuses, right? If I'm walking down the street, the president is walking towards me, and he's not surrounded by his Secret Service, he's not surrounded by my Well, no one. He'll say, "Hi, Louis," and I'll say, "Hi, Mr. President." And then you feel good, right? Here's the minus. You're always compared. In my family, you're compared. We started the exact same place. So you're sitting down at Thanksgiving dinner and they say, "Hey, how are things going?" And I start talking about some multi-billion-dollar deal I worked on. I start talking about some wonderful product and vagaries of tort and patent reform, and I'm just rolling. And they're like, "Yeah, okay. How's your friend Barack as the leader of the free world?" So, Fortune 200 GC, leader of the free world. It's my cross to bear. It's kind of humbling. So anyway, graduated in 91, got a job at Arnold & Porter. My thinking was I could work for a small office of a big firm and get a lot of experience quickly. Now remember the part I told you about Harvard doesn't teach you how to be a lawyer. Well, you learn how to be a lawyer when you go to a law firm, right? If you go to a small law firm, they expect that you already know how to be a lawyer. And I didn't. So in my mind, I was Clarence Darrow. In reality, I was more like Vinny Gambini from My Cousin Vinny. I got thrown into these monstrous cases. I had to swim or drown. Fortunately, I learned how to swim. By my second year, I was arguing cases in the 10th Circuit, Federal Circuit. Things were going pretty well. Then I started to look around, and I thought to myself, this is kind of unfulfilling. I don't feel like I'm doing anything. What I learned here, and what I learned at Harvard was, there's more. I want more. So I decided, I want to go someplace where I can actually do something, where I can create something. There, what happens is, I was a litigator, right? So you win, you lose, you settle. 95% of cases settle. You walk away, there's nothing. Fortunately, Motorola, which was a big client of ours, needed some work done, and they asked me to come and do it. So I did it. I went down and packed up. I moved to Atlanta, and it was cool. I got to, we were working on batteries, so I got to see our products working in various different aspects, and it was really, really cool. Then I thought to myself, well, what do I want to do? What's the highest level that you can get to as a lawyer in a company? Well, I looked up and I said, well, somewhere I can become a CEO. I thought, well, I'm the lowest level guy in the company at the moment. It's going to be hard to get to be CEO. So I set my sights a little lower, and I said, I'll be GC, next level down. So I set my sights on that. I went to all the different businesses that Mike talked about. I was in every business within the company. Learned all the products, learned the business models, learned the culture. And around 2007, 2008, I got identified as the prospective new general counsel. Well, unfortunately, in 2000, you may remember this. You're old enough to remember this. 2007, 2008, a couple of things happened. First, remember this phone? Anybody remember this phone? Yeah, we made a lot of those phones. Millions and millions and millions of phones. In fact, our wonderful CEO at the time, now the current guy, one time they asked him, what's next? All he said was more razors. That was our strategy, more razors. Well, guess what? Bob fell out of the cell phone market. This little ditty came along, and Apple ate our lunch. We were losing $1.5 billion a year in the cell phone market. I wasn't in the cell phone business anymore. I was in the two-way radio business at the time. But I was still part of the company. The cell phone business was dragging us down. So then along came a guy who some of you may know, Carl Icahn. Anybody heard of Carl Icahn? Yeah. Well, the reason Michael Douglas is up there from Wall Street is because his character, Gordon Gekko, in that movie, you probably saw the recent one a couple of years ago, was modeled after Carl Icahn. Carl Icahn is an activist investor. Carl Icahn said, I think I can run your business better than you can. And so Carl came in, advocated for certain things, including spinning off the cell phone business, and he started a proxy fight. And so we fought him, ultimately wound up settling, but we decided we were going to spin off the cell phone business. Well, those of you business majors know that in order to spin off a multi-billion-dollar company, what do you need? Capital. You need a capital market, right? You need the capital market. Well, guess what happened next? Capital markets shriveled up. Banks went away. There was no opportunity for us to spin them off anymore. So for 2 years, we sat. Make a long story short, I became the GC. In 2010, January of 2011, we ultimately wound up spinning off the cell phone business. They became Motorola Mobility, we were Motorola, we changed our name to Motorola Solutions. Then, so I stayed there for 2.5 years. Then Corning came knocking. Anybody been to Corning? Anybody show of hands? Anybody from Corning? Yeah, well, Corning's a wonderful place, a wonderful company. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. You fly into Corning the first time, you think you're in Middle Earth. You're looking for hobbits, I swear to God. It's unbelievable. It's hard to get to Corning. So I was a little put off by that at first, but then I started getting really intrigued. The reason I got intrigued is because I grew up in Rochester, right up the road. Corning was an iconic brand. This company is innovating in ways that you can't even believe. Now you're probably thinking about Corning, and you're thinking Corning cookware, right? No, we sold that business in the 90s. Corning, the company today, is at the technological epicenter of telecommunications. Who's made a phone call today on a cell phone? Everybody, right? You touched the Corning product. Who's been on an iPad? Who's been on a laptop? Who's been on a computer? Who's watched television? Every one of those products is a Corning product. So I'll show you something in a second that was part of the reason why I decided to come there. At least I think I'll show you something in a second. All right. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It was called the Daymaker Glass. This is talking about some of the wonderful products that Corning is making with companies that you are familiar with today. So as you can see, we are working, this is real stuff. We are working on things that you only see in movies right now. Great innovation companies think 5, 10, 15, 20 years out into the future. Corning is one of those companies. Great innovation companies don't think about how we interact now. They think about how we interact in the future. How will we get our media? How will we communicate with one another? How will we transport each other? How will we take all of the digital things that we want and be able to access them tomorrow? And so that's what persuaded me that I wanted to do with Corning. So, now you know a little bit about me, and you know a little bit about my journey. Let's talk about ethics. So, I promised you the Socratic method, which I learned at Harvard Law School. Didn't like it, but I learned it. So some of you gunners sitting up front, I'm going to ask you a question. Sorry. Tell me what you think ethics means. Sure, stand. Give your name, rank, serial number.
My name is Jen. I'm a finance major. First thing I communicate, you're great. You're definitely a big deal. So I just drop by. What happens? Hopefully I can learn something from you for my future. You know how many friends, bad friends, and things. Check out, see what happens.
All right, cool. What do you think ethics means?
I think it's more of moral stuff, for me, more recognition.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Gunner number 2. Name, rank, serial number. Okay, so yeah, I agree with all of that. So basically, what you're saying is do the right thing, right? Basically, that's what ethics means, and I agree with that. I think that is absolutely right. But I think in order to really understand it, let's take a look at it a little bit more granularly. Let's take a look at the evolution of it, okay? So I did some research. Some of it I knew from classes I took here, interestingly enough. I would like to say that I went back and looked at my notes, but I don't want to lie, I'm here. So some of it I just did new research on, some of it I actually remember. But the first thing, wow, that's ugly. So, in most cultures, the origin of ethics is basically of divine origin, right? It's connected with religion. Whether we're talking about ancient Babylonia, which is this is the Code of Hammurabi, or we're talking about the 10 Commandments, or we're talking about Hinduism in Manusri, or we're talking about Christianity, in Jesus Christ, who I think we could probably all agree was a pretty ethical guy, right? So, in response, going back to the Ten Commandments, in response to the question from the Pharisees, which one of them was a lawyer, I'll admit it, what he asked him was, he said, which of the 10 commandments are the greatest? And I'm not going to call him Socratic now, because then you're really going to get in trouble. And what he said, so what he said was, the greatest is to love God with your heart, your soul, and your mind. That's number one. And the second, which is related to the first, is to love your neighbor as yourself. Which, interestingly enough, Confucius also agreed with that. So, all of these ideas, some of which at the time were radical thought, form the fundamentals of ethics as we know it from a religious standpoint. They all are built on the same foundation that humanity and society are built on the planks of coexistence and mutuality. However, as I think we can all agree, as we've observed and we've experienced, religion is not always the best way to get the idea of ethics across. And why is that? Because sometimes when we have our fervent religious beliefs, we don't always agree with one another. And so we fight about it. Sometimes we fight for millennia about it. So the philosophers got in on it. And starting with the Greeks, who are some of my favorites, Socrates articulated that the greatest good is good itself. He taught that the pursuit of and love of the good itself should be our chief aim. Plato, on the other hand, said that being a good person involves achieving internal harmony of the soul. Aristotle built on this, and he said the highest good is doing good that leads to a good life. A lot of goods there. And that fixed behaviors lead to good outcomes. Then we get to Thomas Aquinas, and he moved us further along the secular path, or the secular ethical spectrum with his natural law theory, and he said that the nature of humans in and of itself determines what is good and what is bad. And you move up a few centuries, and you get to Immanuel Kant, who moved us even further away from Plato's view by arguing that being good comes from a sense of duty to humanity. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now, closer to our time period, the Brits developed the theory of utilitarianism, which is almost socialistic or volcanistic if you're a Star Trek fan. In basically what they said is what is good is what leads to the greatest happiness for the most people. Now, in the last century or so, philosophers started to think even more about establishing ethical values, ethical rules in response to things that were happening in the world. So, for example, in response to the Holocaust, they started to think even more, taking it away from religion, even further away from what the philosophers were saying, into establishing actual concrete rules. But we can see that for the last thousands and thousands of years, people have been wrestling with this idea. Now, the idea of business ethics itself, is even more new than that. So in the 70s and the 80s, people started thinking more about how business should behave. Prior to that, it was basically businesses behave the way that the law said that they should behave. In the 70s and 80s, they started thinking further beyond that. Part of the reason they started thinking further beyond that is because of these mega corporations. Corporations like Motorola, corporations like Corning. And at one end of the spectrum, we have Milton Friedman. How many people know who Milton Friedman is? You know Milton Friedman? So Milton Friedman was an economist, and Milton Friedman basically said the obligation of corporations is to make money. He almost said to make money and stopped. But then he said, make it legal. So make sure that you stay within the law. The other end of the spectrum, we have people like Ron Duster. And what he said is, hang on a second. It's not just about making money. It's not just about following the law. We should be ethical about that as well. He's actually still alive. I think died in maybe 2005 2006. So who's right? Well, I would say that the truth lies somewhere in between these two. If you look at corporations today, every corporation, there's not a single public company in the United States of America that doesn't have a code of conduct. Not one. I haven't looked at them all, but I can guarantee you. I'll take that back. So that might suggest that people have rejected what Bill Friedman said, right? But I think if you look closer, I don't think it necessarily means that. I think what people may have done, what corporations may have done, is they may say, I think Milton Friedman is probably right, but in order to do what Milton Friedman said, I have to behave ethically. And so, like I said, the truth is somewhere in between there two, in between those two. My personal view, Friedman's right. I think Friedman's right. Corporations exist to make money. Corporations are immoral entities. Corporations have no feelings, they have no brains, they have no nervous systems, they have no soul, they can't go to heaven, they can't go to hell. So why do we want them to be ethical? The fact that I think that he may be right doesn't mean that I don't think that they should be ethical. First of all, corporations, in fact, do sometimes act like people, right? There may be people. There's no corporation that exists where there aren't people running what they do, right? They act like people both legally and to some extent, I would argue, emotionally. As human beings, we make decisions every day based upon what we know to be right and what we know to be wrong, right? So it's not enough to say that a corporation isn't human when it's run by humans, right? In another way, they're treated like humans from a legal standpoint, right? They can contract with others. They pay taxes, just like everyone else. They can hold title to property, just like everybody else. And they are subject to the rule of law. And if that wasn't enough, Mitt said so. But I'm not sure, and everybody, you know, when he said that, a lot of people laughed at him and, you know, made things like this about him. But I don't think that's exactly what he meant. And I'll get into that in a second. And not everybody agrees with his view, right? If you go down to Texas, that's what you'll see. So notwithstanding all of this, I would argue corporations have a duty to act ethically for two significant reasons. One, in order for a corporation to most effectively do what Milton Friedman said on a long-term basis, they have to act ethically. They can do what they want in the short term, and we've seen that. And we'll talk about some examples of that in a second. If they can act however they want on a short-term basis, and they can make a ton of money, but you know what? It goes away, because they go. In order to do what they are required to do, they have to do it on a long-term basis, and that requires ethics. They exist in this ecosystem of humanity, and even though they're not people, they have impacts on people. So we'll talk a little bit about that. When corporations act unethically, they have massive negative impact on the communities in which they sit, whether you're talking on a national level, or whether you're talking on a global level, or whether you're talking on a local level. And in order to just illustrate the point, we can look at headlines that we've seen for the last decade. We can talk about WorldCom. We can talk about Enron. We can talk about Adelphia. We can talk about Tyco. We can talk about Walmart. Although I would say Walmart is trying to act ethically. There are headline after headline after headline of companies who spent a lifetime building a reputation and took a second to bring it down. So I would say probably the poster child for unethical behavior in the last decade has got to be Enron. And Adelphia's got to be a close second. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Enron specifically. So Enron, at its peak, Enron employed 22,000 people. They were an energy company. They distributed energy, they did energy commodities trading. They reported revenue in 2000 of $100 billion. That's a lot of money. $100 billion. $60 billion market cap. They were the darling of Wall Street in 1996. They were considered America's most innovative company. They were called America's most innovative company 6 years running by Fortune magazine. Within months, they were gone. They were in shambles. So what happened? Well, Enron used perfectly legal accounting practices to do a number of different things. First, they recorded their revenue in a creative way. Every time you hear creative and you hear an accountant or a lawyer say it, your antenna should go up. So they did it in a very creative way. They recorded the revenue from their commodity trading contracts the way that other investment vehicles have been traded on Wall Street that didn't apply to the energy. It was legal, but it was creative. They also did something, and you probably learned about this in classes, called market accounting. Never been done in this field before. Essentially what it does is it allows you to record projected profits. The other thing that they did is they set up special purpose entities. And these special purpose entities were created, and this is where they got a little bit of follow the law. The first two were perfectly legal, the third one was not. They had these special purpose entities. They would take the losses from the assets that they used to mark to market, and they would put it into special purpose entities. Well, the great thing about special purpose entities is you don't have to talk about that publicly. So you start off by saying, I'm going to build a natural gas plant. And that natural gas plant, I'm going to project that it's going to have $25 million worth of revenue. And you put that in your books. So now, as part of your $100 billion, you put this projected revenue, not real revenue. And then when it has a loss, do you go back to the street and you say to the street, well, I had a loss. It didn't make as much as I thought it was going to make. You have these SPEs, and you put the losses over there. And so it makes it look like your revenues are much higher than they are, and that your profits are much higher than they are. And that's what Enron did. Now, why did they do that? They did it, and I'll talk about culture in a second, but they did it because they wanted their stock price to go up. All companies want their stock price to go up. Well, they wanted their stock price to go up in particular because, at the time, all of their executives were compensated. They're compensated with salary. The salary is the smallest part of what executives at major corporations get paid, even today. Equity, stock options, restricted stock units. So their stock went up, their compensation went up. So that's why they did it. And guess what? It worked. For 4 years, it worked really, really well. They went from $17 billion to $100 billion. Their stock price went from $17 to $90, all in the space of 4 years. When news of what they did came out by virtue of a whistleblower, we won't talk about whistleblowers, but they are an integral part of ensuring that companies remain ethical. It's a tough road to take, and it was a tough road to take for Sharon Watkins, who was the whistleblower in this case, but they're an integral part of keeping companies ethical. When she blew the whistle on them, the entire house of cards came tumbling down. Another company is Adelphia. Anyone ever heard of Adelphia? You're too young. Adelphia was a massive cable company in Kellersport, Pennsylvania. They were like Comcast. Not quite as big as Comcast, but they were rival to Comcast. And what they did was different than what Enron did, although it was still just as unethical. They didn't engage in complicated accounting schemes to run their stock price up. What they did was the Reguses, they used it as their personal piggy bank. They funded all of these different projects, things that they wanted to do, and they masked the fact that they were taking these revenues, these profits out, by fraudulently increasing the rate. Now, I have personal experience with these guys. Oops, let's go back. My experience was in 2002, after their fraud had already come to light. Motorola bought a company called General Instrument, which was a big cable company at the time in Pennsylvania, and we made it our cable division. And in 2002, the general counsel, Peter Lawson, said, "Lewis, I want you to go. I want you to be the head lawyer for the cable division." And like I said, I was moving from business to business, so I thought it was a great idea. So I got there, October 1st or 2nd. First day, Peter calls me and goes, "By the way, I meant to mention, they're being investigated by the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission." Okay. Why? Because of this contract that they entered into in Delphi. Your job, your only job, is to ensure that we don't get indicted. I said, "Well, that's nice. You might have told me that before I took the job, but nonetheless, here we are." So I looked into it. So what we were doing was we would sell cable boxes at a certain price to Adelphia. They would record that as an expense. I'll get back to that in a second. At the same time, we would give them money as market development funds. Anyone know what market development funds are? We haven't been in business long enough yet to know that, right? So market development funds is basically you give money for marketing purposes, right? So if you sell the box for X number of dollars, a certain percentage of that, you give that money to your customer. We accounted for all of this correctly. Perfectly legal, did absolutely nothing wrong. What Adelphia did with it was they took the market and development funds and they called that revenue. The expense that they paid for the boxes, well, they amortized that over the course of the next 20 years. So they took basically 20% of their expense against 100% of their MDF. That's illegal. That's accounting fraud. So why was I being called into the Department of Justice? And by the way, if you ever visit the Department of Justice, no matter what, even though you haven't done anything wrong, you will feel like a criminal. You'll look around for your orange jumpsuit. I did nothing wrong. Even if I had done something wrong, even if my company had done something wrong, I'm not the guy that's going to go to jail, but you still feel like you're going to go to jail. So I went in there, and I said to them, my argument was very simple. I said, I did nothing wrong. My company did nothing wrong. We accounted for this perfectly correctly under GAAP. You know that we accounted for it perfectly correctly under GAAP. Why are you coming after us? They said was, you should have known. You should have known how your customer was accounting for the transaction. I said, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How am I supposed to know how my customer is accounting for their transaction? They said, well, that's why you're here, because you should have known. So we argued back and forth. There's some puts and takes here I'm not getting into, because it wasn't quite as black and white as I'm portraying it. But it was close. So I avoided the indictment. But I'll tell you what, now anytime I see one of those sort of round-trip transactions, I make sure that my business people know how our customer is accounting for it. It's a ridiculous way for us to have to interact with our customers, but I don't want to have to go and visit the Department of Justice again. So Adelphia is gone, another American success story, gone by the wayside because of unethical conduct. How are we supposed to prevent these things from happening in companies? Well, the SEC has come out with a set of rules, and what they said, basically, is we want you to comply with the laws, the rules, the regulations. That's table stakes, right? We want you to prevent conflicts of interest. We want you to maintain confidentiality. We want you to deal fairly with your customers, your suppliers, your employees. And we want you to prohibit your employees from taking personal opportunities to start with their job. We want you to require your employees to protect the company's assets, and we want you to encourage reporting of any illegal behavior. Basically, they said what you two said. We want your company to do the right thing. Now, Motorola and Corning both have codes of conduct which incorporate all of these and more. Motorola and Corning both have a chief ethics and compliance officer, and that chief ethics and compliance officer reports to me. Well, Motorola doesn't anymore, but he did. The one at Corning reports to me, and reports directly to the board of directors as well. And that person is responsible for ensuring that we engage in ethical behavior. On top of that, we have this wonderful new law called Sarbanes-Oxley. Anyone heard of Sarbanes-Oxley? So Sarbanes-Oxley came about because of the headlines that I told you about before, because of WorldCom, because of Adelphia, because of Enron. And basically what it says is every key executive within the company will sign on a quarterly basis a certification that your accounting statements are correct. And it's a pain in the neck. This pendulum has swung a little far, but it was necessary given the kinds of things that we saw. And corporations take it extremely seriously. We have a disclosure committee. Both companies have a disclosure committee that meets with the top managers and goes over every disclosure, goes over every financial statement. And then there's another meeting with the CEO, the CFO, and the GC, and we go through it with the entire disclosure committee. And it's kind of a formal process. It's like a ceremony for them to sign this thing. If it doesn't get signed, we don't file the Q. We don't file the K. It's a big deal. So the question then is that enough? Is it enough to have a code of conduct? Is it enough to have a chief ethics and compliance officer? Is it enough to have Sarbanes-Oxley and to comply with it? And I would answer, the answer is no. It's not enough. Those things are table stakes. You've got to have those things. Enron had a 62-page code of conduct. Enron had a chief ethics and compliance officer. They didn't have Sarbanes-Oxley. They caused Sarbanes-Oxley. They didn't have Sarbanes-Oxley. And yet they still engaged in the kind of activity that they engaged in. Why? Culture. That's why. You can have all the rules you want. You can have all the laws you want. If your culture is broken, you will engage in unethical behavior. There are common anecdotes about the kind of things that Enron would do. Jeff Skilling, their CEO, his favorite book was something called The Selfish Gene. He told everyone that his favorite book was The Selfish Gene. Now, it's actually not that bad of a book, but he would tell people this. Their CFO, the guy who came up with the mark-to-market in this particular application, came up with the SPEs. He knew that his actions were somewhat dodgy. He knew he had to get dispensation from the board. So he went, he requested it, and you know what? They gave it to him. That's bad culture. The traders, when the California blackouts were happening, the traders would openly boast about how they would increase the demand, decrease the supply, and so they could increase their prices. So they could increase their prices. That's a broken culture. No matter what's in place, that's going to happen if your culture is broken. Now, I've seen the opposite in companies that I've been involved with Motorola and with Corning. Motorola, whenever there's a tragedy around the world, Motorola will supply communications equipment free of charge. They go in and set it up, and it runs, because that's a huge part of what happens in emergencies. Now, I know some of the more cynical people are probably thinking, well, that's good marketing, and it's good for the company. Well, yes, it is, but it also demonstrates character. They don't have to do that. It demonstrates character. Corning is built on a foundation of corporate responsibility. This company's been around for 160 years. They're not just a Fortune 200 company, global company. They are the largest employer in the southern tier of New York. Half of Corning's, like I said, it's like Middle Earth, but there's 11,000 people in Corning. Half of them work at Corning. The other half used to work at Corning, or were married to somebody that worked at Corning. The other half of that other half knows somebody at Corning. That instills within the executives the sense of responsibility to the community. I've actually never seen anything like it before. Even at Motorola, I hadn't seen anything like it before. I had open discussions with the CEO about his sense of responsibility to the community. He knows that if Corning goes away, the community goes away. The Chemung Valley goes away. You don't see that in major corporations. You don't even see that in corporations in Chicago, because if Boeing goes away, there's going to be another company. If McDonald's goes away, there's another company. Walgreens, there's another company. In Corning goes away, that's it, over, done. So that instills within their executives this sense of responsibility, and it permeates through everything that we do. We have a set, one of our values, which I found bizarre when I got there, is to remain independent. Now, as a lawyer, and as a securities lawyer, if somebody tells you that one of your core values is to remain independent, the first thing you do is worry. Because it's not always a good thing to remain independent if that's not going to maximize shareholder value, right? It may make sense for you to be sold. It may make sense for someone to buy you. Corning will never, I shouldn't say they won't ever let that happen. It may happen regardless of what they or I do, but they're not going to go without a fight. And the reason for that is because of the sense of community that they have and this code of ethics that they have that is, they feel so much a part of that local community, which then permeates to the national community, which then permeates to the global community. So, let me just summarize and then I'll open it up for questions. Where does it lead us? Why is ethics so core to our business? To business. I'll sum it up by saying this. Conducting a business ethically and thinking about a company is a key component of the ecosystem in which we live, has been proven to lead to the long-term health of the communities in which we live, which then leads to the long-term health of the company in which we operate. Long-term health means maximization of long-term profits. So that's it. That's my view on it, and we'll open it up for questions. Sir.
Probably a bit of a hallmark, but when you were at Siena, the values that came into your life, should you sincerely believe that they brought you to where you are today and holding out those as part of your life throughout that?
Absolutely. The values that I learned here still carry, even though I haven't been back here in 25 years, I still carry those with me in every decision that I make. Every time I think about what is the right thing to do, it goes back to what I was taught in undergrad. Not just what I was taught in undergrad, but what I was taught by my family, what I was taught by my mom, what I was taught by my dad. But a big part is what I learned here. And there's a couple of things I'll say. Sorry, I have a cold. It's been going on for about a week and a half, and I can't shake it. When I'm negotiating a deal, or I'm litigating, or any major issue that I'm working on, I notice two things immediately from the person on the other side. One, I notice whether or not they have any ethics, and I try to think about where did this person go to school, where did they grow up, and I won't talk about China, because that's a whole different issue, because it's not an unethical society, they just view it very differently that would make it seem to us like it's unethical. But so the first thing I notice is, do they have ethics? Where did they come from? The second thing I notice is, were they an athlete? And I can tell. I can tell by the way they argue with me. I can tell by how competitive they are. I can tell about their spirit of camaraderie, whether or not they were athletes. And then I ask them after the whole deal was done whether they were athletes or not. And 90% of the time, I'm like, which doesn't have anything to do with your question, but it's just something that I've observed.
Please use the microphones when asking a question. We are taping it, and they cannot hear us if we do not use the microphones.
Sure.
What's your motivation?
What is my motivation?
Yeah.
That's a good question. So growing up, it never occurred to me that I wasn't going to succeed. I don't know why. It had something to do with my parents, I guess. And so my motivation was always myself. whether it was athletics or whether it was academics, my motivation was just succeeding. I was pretty competitive, I guess I still am a pretty competitive person. My motivation now, I turned 50 the 18th of October. And I started thinking, not necessarily about motivation, but what my goals are. What's my next goal? And they don't really have anything to do with me anymore. There's other things I can do. Maybe I'll become the CEO of a company somewhere. Maybe I'll be the GC of a bigger company. Maybe I'll go into business. Maybe I'll go teach. I don't know. But they really relate more now to my family, right? My daughters, my son. What do I want them to do? What kind of things do I want to instill in them? What kind of role model do I want to be to them? And that's kind of what motivates me now. The more self-centered things are kind of gone now. It's more about my family these days. All right, now we're getting warmed up. That's good.
I have no. Oh, wait. Can you? Okay. Did you ever have a struggle between, like, with yourself, with your business, like thinking more about success rather than ethics? Is that ever become a problem?
Me personally?
Yeah, or within the business and the business you work for?
No, I really never did. And maybe it's because of the kind of companies that I've worked for, because ethics has always been a core value, is a core value of Motorola. The one time I had a bit of a struggle was when I worked in private practice, when I worked for Arnold & Porter. A big client of ours was Philip Morris, when they were still a cigarette manufacturer, before they changed the name. What do they call it? Altria? Or I don't know what they call it now. But, so they were a big client of ours, so I knew a lot of our revenue was coming. And everybody had to go through it. Everybody had to represent Philip Morris. And so not my first, it was one of my first depositions, I had to take a deposition in a hospital room of a person who had lung cancer and didn't have very long to live. And I knew that they had read all the warnings, and they started smoking after the warnings came out, and so they were, we always call it the idiot defense, right? It says don't smoke, and you still smoke. But I sat there as I deposed this person who I knew was going to die, and I thought about all the things, even though what Philip Morris was doing was legal, I didn't think it was right what they were doing. And so I went back and talked to one of my buddies who, you could always, you had the option. You didn't have to work for them if you didn't want to. And I didn't really have a moral dilemma about it until I took that deposition. And so he actually put it in a very nice way. He actually became the U.S. attorney, or a U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. And he said to me, his name was Malus, he said, if you continue working for Philip Morris, you will be a foot soldier for the forces of evil. Which sort of struck me in a way that I really hadn't thought about. I actually kept working for them for probably another 6 months, but I didn't do any more of the cigarette cases. I did employment discrimination cases, and then I stopped working for them. I just couldn't deal with it anymore. So I felt like what they were doing was perfectly legal. Ethical was a little trouble for me. But at Motorola, never really presented itself, and accordingly it hasn't presented itself. Excuse me.
I'm also a Siena grad, but from 1963, so from a different perspective.
Yeah.
I've been in the business world for 47 years, and I worked for GE for 30 years. Unfortunately, under the auspices of Jack Welch, at Golub. And then I've been consulting for the last 12 years until the start of projects. So I've visited hundreds of companies, and I don't see any ethics at all. I think, as the movie at Wall Street, greed is the motivator. And it's what they try to do is make as much money as possible legally. They aren't afraid of the law. They don't want to get caught. But ethics, I don't see ethics. And do the right thing, I do see dedication. They're mostly in family fellows who are now sponsoring this series. I worked with them, actually. I was going to Siena, stock clerk. And you see it there, today, it's really bad. It's like you say, if you aren't ethical, if you aren't looking for the good, you're going to go out of business. GE is just about gone out of New York City. Kodak, belly up. Xerox, belly up. IBM is left. All started in New York State. Now, Corning, as you mentioned, is a real exception because we do have this upstate, downstate, and downstate pretty much runs, and so we're in trouble. So, the older I get, I'm trying to be optimistic. I'm really pessimistic about saying there are a lot of good people, meet good people, but the corporations themselves are interested in maximizing profits and ethics. That's why I was so curious to hear your thought, because it's, other than a few small family-owned businesses, I don't see it.
So I guess I'd say a couple of things to that. First, I think part of the issue is probably where you started, not Sienna. The GE. Now, I'm not going to say bad things about GE. GE's done wonderful things for lots of people. GE's culture was up and out. Still is, as far as I know. I never worked for them. I know a lot of people that work there. They had the relative performance metric. So every year, what they would do, I don't know if you folks in the audience know this, every year, they review you against your peers. The bottom 10%, you're gone. So,
Fourth ranking.
force ranking, right. We tried to implement that in Motorola, and it went by the wayside because it just didn't work. Because you could continue to do it, but pretty soon you're cutting your bone. I mean, after a while, you got rid of all of the dead wood. Now you're cutting your bone. So yeah, it's like the Chicago Bulls in the '90s, right? All of them are good. You want to cut one of them? Okay, you can if you want. But now you're cutting you're not cutting into fat anymore, you're cutting into muscle, you're cutting into bone. So GE has a culture that I would agree with you. It's a bit of an anomaly. The fact that they've been around as long, and maybe it's just because they're so massive. I've said what I need to say about Motorola and Corning. What I would say about what we need to do is exactly what it is that we're doing. We have to get to people at a younger and younger age to make sure that they understand that Milt Friedman was wrong. That it is not about maximizing profits. Or if it is about maximizing profits, that you understand that to maximize profits in the long term, you have to be ethical, or you're going to be gone. Will GE figure it out before it's too late? I don't know. Did RIM? Did Nokia? Those are massive companies who don't figure it out. And I won't say that RIM or Nokia had ethical problems, but these are massive companies that are not what they were previously. So could GE go that way? Maybe.
Can I add one thing to this? I got interested in management, although I was never a manager. I'm a chemist. I've been a technical guy my whole life. And I get interested in management, so I went over to RPI. I have a master's degree in management from RPI. And the professor who taught a very interesting course in management was Professor Law, the Law School of Management. He said, you should get up every morning, take your wife's lipstick, and put on your mirror. What business am I in? What business am I in? And all your decisions flow from that, answering that question. And he said, there's one wrong answer to that question. That's to make money. If that's your answer, you will fail. He says, because making money is the byproduct of answering that question properly. I noticed when I started in the 60s going to work, it wasn't like it is now. People cared about the company and wanted the company to stay. They wanted to exist. They wanted to be there after. When I left GE, I was a guy with 30 years experience. They didn't was 30 years experience walking up to this. And I wasn't the only one, just one member.
Yeah.
But it became more of a self-read it today. G used to report, every half year, and it was every quarter, it was every month, every week. What are your numbers? Did you make your numbers? They're not the only ones. But they kind of set the tone, many of these groups.
Every company has to think short term now. Long term for a company these days isn't even, right? And part of the reason for that is I don't want to blame the activists too much, but I've had lots of fights with these guys, is because of what the street says, right? The street wants to know, how did you do this quarter? And interestingly, you can study this, when you look at how companies do on a quarter by quarter basis, they don't care how you did in the previous quarter. You come out and do earnings, and you talk about, we had a great quarter, we grew 10%, we grew OE by X percent, blah, 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 we returned this much cash to shareholders. They're like, yeah, that's great. How are you going to do next quarter? And if you say, I'm not going to do as well next quarter as I did a quarter ago or a year ago this same quarter, your stock drops. So everyone has been thinking, I have got to return, I've got to maximize my return to my shareholders on a quarter by quarter by quarter basis. And I think you're right. I think that drives certain sorts of behaviors. The only way to counter it, in my opinion, is with the culture. You have to do, forget Motorola for a second, because I'm not there anymore. You have to do what Corning was doing. You have to think about yourself long, long, long term. You can't be driven by what the activists say. You can't be driven by what the street says. You have to think about it. And the reason that you have to think about it is because if you don't, they will take it and they will do it for you. Part of the reason why Corning hired me is because I fought Icon, because I fought Jeff Puppet. And they know that if your stock price is low, and you have a lot of cash, and you have a little bit of debt, and you can't really understand the balance sheet, guess who's going to come knocking on your door? And unfortunately, you don't fight these guys. You settle with these guys. You don't fight with these guys. And so what I always advocate, what I learned, is just because an activist says it's a bad idea doesn't necessarily make it a bad idea. Don't have a visceral reaction to them. Look at the idea, see whether or not it's good. If it is good, get out in front of them. Get out in front of them and do it as long as you think that it's maximizing shareholder value the way you want to maximize shareholder value. So if you want to maximize shareholder value for the long term, do the kind of thing that they might be advocating. Sell a business. Give cash back to your investors. Issue a special dividend. Do a share purchase if you need to. As long as you stay true to your core values. A lot of companies aren't doing that, unfortunately. And I don't want to be too defensive of those companies because I don't work for them, but some of it's not their fault. It's this here and now mentality that the street requires.
Do you have any feeling for the Japanese society and how they've done it? They seem to have the long-term view. We can see it in their own business.
Well, they did.
They did.
Yeah, they did. I mean, they had a long-term view. I think we're starting to see that start to erode a little bit. The Asian culture, I've dealt with the Japanese, I've dealt with the Chinese, and I've dealt with the Koreans now. They're all obviously very different. They're all Asian, but they're all very different cultures. The Japanese culture was probably, at the time when it was at its peak, had the longest term vision. I think that's being replaced by the Chinese now. The Chinese have an incredible long-term vision. The problem is that the Chinese view of ethics is very different than the Western view of ethics. I had a big trade secret misappropriation case against a company in China. And when you sue a company in China, and they're big enough, you sue China, basically. And I sat across the table from the general counsel of this company, and he admitted that he stole our trade secrets. He said, yes, we did. However, what you don't understand is that we don't view it the same way that you do. Here, we don't view it as who created the intellectual property. We view it as who grows the intellectual property. It's like a tree. It's not who planted the tree. It's who nurtured the tree. And so we and they have to get more in sync. That's what I told them. I said, if you want to do business in the rest of the Western world, you're going to have to get more in line with the way we think about things here, or we're going to keep suing. And you see that a lot. You still see there's trade secret case after trade secret case after trade secret case in China because of just a different thought process around intellectual property.
Could you speak to how, let's say Corning, for example, you incorporate your core values of ethics to your relationships with your associates, say particularly towards compensation?
Executive compensation or in general?
Compensation in general.
In general? Well, it's interesting you ask that, because one of the things that we're doing right now is we're dealing with the Glass Lewis's and the ISS's of the world right now on the executive comp. And so we're trying to figure out, is our compensation tied to the kinds of things that it ought to be tied to? And we talked about this a little bit before the session. We're talking about CEO compensation, which is ridiculously high. But then the question is, how do you tie that compensation? You should tie it to the performance of the company, but what performance metrics should you use? Should it be revenue? Should it be OE? Should it be share? Should it be shareholder return? That sort of thing. So the way Corning does it, putting executives to one side, is they try to tie it as much as they can to the performance that the associate controls. So some of it is tied to the overall performance of the company. So a portion of your bonus, for example, there's two different bonuses at Corning. A portion of it is tied to the revenue, and then a portion of it is tied to the thing that you do. If you're in the legal department, it's tied to certain metrics within the legal department. If you're in finance, if you're in business. And then a portion of it is tied to your own personal performance. So I can't remember exactly the percentage. I think it goes 70, 20, 10. And the 10 is your own personal performance. So you have to multiply it out by that. And a portion of that is behaviors, right? So I think companies like Corning and Motorola, I don't know about GE, have learned that you have to have both, right? You have to have both the actual performance and you have to have the right behaviors that got you to that actual performance. And so they tie a portion. Should it be higher than that for the behaviors? Maybe. It's a little difficult though, because then it gets a little bit subjective, right? And then people start complaining about the subjectivity. But that's how we do it. We try to tie it in that way. Does that answer your question?
In my understanding, we need something else more than ethics, because ethics is like this external factors, is what the society thinks it's right. It's more about law. I think we need moral. That's your inner principles. That's about what you think is right, wrong. And it might be harder to overcome moral than overcome ethics, because laws have some work throughs.
Yeah.
I'd like to know your thoughts about that.
Well, I would agree. And I actually think that morals are built into the correct definition of ethics. So I think ethics as it has evolved over time kind of started with sort of a legalistic view. Well, in business anyway. Not in personal ethics, but in business it started more with a legalistic view. But I think what you're probably saying is that there's something wrong with society, right? There's something wrong with people right now. We've got to fix that. And if we can fix that, then we'll fix the problem that's within the businesses. And I would agree with that. We could go all night talking about exactly how you do that. But in answer to one of the other questions earlier, I talked about my own upbringing and what I learned here and what I learned from my family. And that's, I think, a big part of what we need to see in business. We need more people. I won't say more people like me. Because I certainly have my own issues, but we need more people who are trained similarly to me. And there are a lot of people like that. There are people within Corning, there are people within Golub, there are people that I do business with that are across the table from me, who I think are very moral people. We don't have enough, though. And I think to the gentleman's point earlier, I think we're sort of in this down slide at the moment. I'm hoping that it'll turn itself back around. Part of doing that is things like this. You know, I and other people have to talk more about why it's so important to have ethics, the correct ethics within the workplace, so that when you are all out there, and when you're standing up here, when you're the CFO or GC or CEO of a company, you'll remember this speech, or you'll remember your class where you talked about it. I know ethics is being taught in many college classrooms around the country. I don't know that it's being taught in as many as it should. I took a class on it while I was at Harvard. So it was taught there, it was taught in undergrad, it was taught in law school. So I think we have to have more and more of that. And then we have to, you know, our families are, well, but our families are deteriorating, and we got to shore that up. But that's a bigger problem than I can solve at the moment.
With ethics becoming so important in the business world, I know as a Siena grad, do you have any advice to soon-to-be Siena grads on how to market the morals and ethics and even the Franciscan values that we learn here going out into the business world? Because they are going to be important going into the future with ethics being such a big deal.
It's a really good question. I did. It was just sort of part of what I learned. It was part of me. I guess I do now, but I don't talk about it in terms of this is what I learned at Siena. This is the Franciscan values that I learned. I don't talk about it like that. I don't market it like that. I just live it. And I think I have to think about it, but I think that's probably the best way to do it. I don't know that you want to go into a job interview and say, hey, you talk about the Franciscan values, and you might turn them off a little bit. You might not, depends on who you're talking to, right? I'm actually noticing a lot more Siena grads in the business world, particularly really successful people. I'm surprised. Well, I guess I shouldn't be, but I could, you know, sit across the table with somebody, they're like, oh, you know, you went to Siena? I went to Siena. Well, really went to that? And blah, blah, blah. You know, I see a lot more of that with Harvard because it's a bigger school. So, but I guess I'm not sure I would come right out and market it sort of in your face. I think I would just live it, probably the way you're living it now, and continue living it, and just show people. Show them by your actions what you learned, what you learned from your family, what you learned from church, what you learned from school, and in that way, market it with yourself. But it's a good question. I have to think about it. I never really thought about it.
Do you think that, to a point, only to a point that you can teach ethics, and from there on it comes from who someone is?
No, actually, I don't. I think you can continue to teach ethics. I think you can. I think if somebody's just evil, they're going to remain evil. There's nothing you're going to do about that. And there is evil in the world. And that person's going to remain evil. I think, by and large, people want to be good. That's been my experience. And I've experienced a lot of wacky stuff. But I think, by and large, people want to be good. And if you can show them or teach them the right things to do, by and large, they'll do it. I think it's harder as people get older because, and I'll put myself in that category now that I turned 50, we get less flexible. Our brains are less flexible, our morals are less flexible, we're set in our ways, right? It takes a lot to get us to think different. That said, it's not like we're in Oscar. I mean, or Russian. It's not that hard to do the right thing if someone shows you what to do. And you have to be surrounded. It's kind of like assimilation. You just sort of keep continuing on with this language metaphor. It's like assimilation. When you're in it, and you see everybody else doing it, and it's the culture, and they're all speaking the same language about, doing the ethical thing, that's when it sinks in, I think. So I don't think you should ever stop. I don't think you should ever stop trying. I like Anne Frank, I'm a bit of an optimist and believe in the goodness of people. Not quite the optimist she was, but.
Do you believe that the sense of community instilled in Siena is similar to the community in Corning?
That's not what I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to say Harvard. I'll answer your question first, and then I'll talk about Harvard. Yes, I do. I really do. And I was a commuter, but I still felt a sense of community. I don't think there are as many commuters now as there were back in the dark ages. But there was even then there was a real sense of community. When I first got here and I transferred, I felt a real sense of community immediately. And you may notice I don't look like everybody here. And I was a transfer student that came in, and people just wrapped their arms around me, and I had this unbelievable sense of community immediately. And it made me, it gave me the foundation, really, of who I am today, partially. I see the same thing at Corning. Corning, the difference, though, I think Siena's an evolving, dynamic community, and I noticed it just driving around. Things are changing so much in a really good way. And so it's always growing. I think it's because you keep bringing young people in, right? Corning, they've been around for 160 years, and some of the people, I think, started there 160 years ago. God, see that. Sorry. It's an older sense of community, but it's similar. Harvard, not so much. Harvard was not quite as bad as what you see in the movies, where they said look to your right, look to your left, one of you won't be here. It wasn't quite that bad, but it was pretty competitive. You didn't really feel a sense of community. You kind of felt like the best thing I did was getting in here, and the best thing I'm going to do is get out with the degree that I got. It wasn't like here, where when you get to your fourth year, you don't want to go. Well, thank God I was there to go.
I had one more question.
Sure.
To you personally, what do you believe makes you successful? What's your definition of success?
It's changed. My definition of success has changed over time. Like I said, I never really thought I wouldn't be a success. I don't know where that comes from my parents or whatever. It never occurred to me that I would say. The definition of success when I came out of here was to get a good job. And I wanted to be married, and I wanted to have kids, I wanted to raise a family. And so I wanted more and more success, right? I wanted to be able to provide for them things that I didn't have as I was growing up. I've never liked money for money's sake. I have friends who and I kid you not, who just like money. They want to just roll in money. I have a good friend who wants to buy his own jet. Well, let's just say, why do you buy it? It's tens of millions of dollars. There's a fuel cost. So you have to be mega millionaire. He just likes it. He just wants to have money. I've never been that way. I like money to do the things that I want to do. I like to be able to give back. I like to be able to donate. I like to be able to give this year. I like to be able to, give to the charities that I like. So my definition of success has changed over time. Now it's to make sure that my children have the same opportunities that I had, and that they are not necessarily as successful, but they have the opportunity to be. As you get older, you get very reflective, right? You want to be a good person. Sure, I really thought about that as much. I think I was, but I didn't think about it as much. Maybe it's because I'm getting older. I want to make sure I get into heaven. I don't know. But I want to be a good person. I want to do the right thing. So my definition of success has moved. It's morphed over time. And it's not so much about sort of the trappings of success that I have. Maybe part of that is just because I have it, right? But it's more. Sure. My definition of success used to be I wanted to break 4 minutes in the mile. That didn't happen. Now I'm a lawyer.
Hi. It strikes me that you were an English major, and probably most of the students here are in business. Could you put in a plug for English as a way of developing perhaps an imagination or ability to be flexible in your thinking that would help in the business world, particularly with regard to seeing and perceiving moral problems? Is that it?
No, absolutely. I think well, from a law school perspective, my personal view is the best degree you can have to go into law school is either English, philosophy, or economics. That's my opinion. And the reason behind that is because all three of those teach you to think. Now, I didn't know this going into law school, because like I said, I thought they were teaching me how to be a lawyer. I didn't know they were teaching me to think like a lawyer. And so what I learned from being an English major was how to think in an analytical way, to dissect things, to be able to read something and say what it meant, to be able to tell someone what I thought it meant. The greatest thing I always found about being an English major was I could pretty much say it meant whatever I thought it meant, as long as I was able to back it up, right? And so, similarly, in law or in business, if you have that ability to back it up, if you have that ability to critically analyze a problem, or a brief, or a document, or a financial statement, and be able to back up your opinion about that, I think it helps. From a moral standpoint, it's interesting, because I read a lot. I don't anymore, unfortunately. I don't write anymore. I read a lot, but they have nothing to do with what I learned here. There's a different kind of reading and writing. It really does, I think, expand your mind. I think being a business major is great. There's nothing wrong, obviously, with being a business major. But it expands your mind in a way that focusing specifically on sort of scientific analysis doesn't necessarily allow you to do. It narrows you a little bit more. And I found that English helps me. I still read, my children give me a hard time about this, but I still read poetry. I like Longfellow, I like Wadsworth. I still Wordsworth, excuse me. And sometimes it helps me to just read that and help put things in perspective. Because from my perspective, poets were like philosophers, or are still like philosophers. And in that, they can look at things in a different way, and they can reach a different part of our mind than sort of the analytical sciences. And I think morals, applying it to morals is similar in that respect. If you can read something and it speaks to you in a way that maybe a treatise by Milton Friedman wouldn't speak to you, maybe it's helpful.
I've always been interested in the temporal nature of ethics, and you alluded to that when you were talking about how it's evolved over time. And certainly what we consider ethical today is different than what we did 50, 150, and certainly 1,500 years ago. So my question is, what do you think they will be looking at critically that we're doing now 50 to 150 years ago, or 150 years in the future?
From an ethics standpoint?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Well, 150 years is a long time. I think ethics in the future is going to revolve. Well, first of all, ethics is evolving, right? And so I think that's going to continue to evolve, and depending on how that's going to evolve is going to determine what's going to happen with ethics. But specifically, I think because of the way in which everyone knows everything about everyone now instantly, there's going to be some new ethical rules that are going to start to evolve around that. What is it appropriate to share? What is it appropriate to read about? What is it appropriate to tweet about or to put on Facebook about? I don't even have a Facebook account anymore because I have a 20-year-old daughter. And some of her friends would say things that I, as you see, Motorola according I really want on my Facebook page. So I think ethics is going to evolve around that. I think it's going to evolve around privacy. From a business perspective, I think the pendulum from a pure rules standpoint has swung pretty far with Sarbanes-Oxley. I think we're going to see it slide a little bit back to the center from where I think, I'm going to be wrong about that. I think it's going to slide a little bit further back. And I'm hoping that we'll see stuff that we've been talking about now, where it's embedded in culture rather than embedded in the rules. But I don't know. I think technology moving the way it's moving, the pace at which it's moving, the kinds of things that companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, Motorola, Corning are doing is so invasive into our lives that we're going to have ethics